Hi there, I'm Casey Rich, a graduate assistant for the Center for Cultural Affairs, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Brian Kisida, author of Arts Education Partnerships, Sources of Harmony and Dissonance with Cultural Institutions, Collaborative Efforts, recently published in Cultural Trends. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So, Brian, before we go any further, would you mind giving our listeners some background on the paper?
Yeah, so the paper is a component of a large study that we've been doing in Houston. And so the Houston model was the Arts Access Initiative. And this brought together some 30 different cultural organizations, everything from the ballet to the symphony to the major art museum to lots of smaller upstarts that do more modern dance performances, all these different things. So all of these different activities, and we started this research quite a few years ago, because there's so many questions that we could answer, the sort of central question that we looked at was, well, what are the effects for students? And so we ran a randomized control trial where we looked at that. And the effects for students were nice. They were positive. We found increases in students' writing scores, increases in student engagement, decreases in disciplinary infraction, and increases in students' compassion. But at the same time, we collect a lot of data through surveys and other methods, focus groups, where we talk to school principals and we talk to leaders of cultural institutions and wanted to get a sense how they were able to work under this common umbrella, which turns out, and this is something that we could sense while we were studying the program, but there's some challenges. There's areas where it works well, and there's areas maybe it could be improved a little bit.
Why would you say that this is such an important area for research? I mean, obviously, arts education is important, but specifically the topic that you chose for this paper.
Well, maybe it's widely known in the cultural sector, but I think it's a little known fact more broadly how much cultural organizations engage in educational activities. I think if you just took a straw poll, I would say most cultural organizations would say about a third of what they do falls under education. The majority of what they engage in is working with schools in K-12 education space to provide some sort of educational interventions. And at the same time, there has been kind of a growing trend of declines in arts education provided by K-12 school systems. I think what we've seen is a trend of cultural organizations helping to fill that space by complementing what schools are already doing and providing world-class education opportunities for students. Every big major city and lots of mid-sized cities tend to have these cultural, not just cultural organizations, but these partnerships of cultural organizations working together under sort of a common umbrella to work towards providing educational opportunities for the students in that region. So it's pretty important to monitor this, see how it's affecting and supplementing K-12 education, see how it's impacting the schools, and see how the cultural organizations are navigating this educational space where they're asked to do things that they might not necessarily do in normal circumstances.
So, what would you say are some of the key takeaways for this paper then?
So I think that some of the key takeaways for cultural organizations come from the survey data. We wanted to gauge a little bit about sort of what they saw as their perceptions of what this program was doing for students. And through that, we could kind of get a sense of whether or not these were things that schools would be interested in or encouraged by. And I think that this could be something that cultural organizations have to think about, and they do think about. So by and large, school systems, if we question them to account for why we've seen a decline in arts education, by and large, it has to do with increased pressure to perform well in core subjects. This can lead to a disconnect if cultural organizations are not following suit. Of course, we don't necessarily want them to follow suit. They should do what they think is best. So one of the things that we did is we asked the cultural organizations what they thought was the impact of the arts that their programming brought about. And by and large, this was not about standardized test scores. The highest things that they articulated were social emotional learning, self-expression, creativity, communication skills, confidence and self-esteem, school engagement, and empathy. And these are all things that schools care about, and it's certainly things that parents care quite a bit about, but they're not those things that are measured. And this could be, somewhat of a disconnect when schools are trying to work with cultural organizations. Only 54% of the cultural organizations thought that the arts programming that they were providing would improve standardized test scores. So that's somewhat of an analysis of what they see as their mission, and we're able to think about how that might differ from the mission of K-12 policymakers, at least as currently operationalized. And then we also wanted to understand how these organizations function together. And this was somewhat driven by things that came up in the focus groups, where we could sense that there was some tension between different organizations that were part of this conglomerate run by this backbone organization. And what we found there was that if you were a smaller, less established arts organization, you saw that the initiative had a lot more benefits to you. And the reason was because if you're the Houston Symphony or the Museum of Fine Arts, you already have the clout and probably the funding and the access to a lot of the schools. Having your stuff on a website alongside other smaller mom and pop arts organizations might actually put you at a disadvantage in terms of reaching more schools. Whereas the smaller, less established arts organizations were much more likely to say that the initiative was beneficial to the organization, that it had diversified the student populations that they were serving, that it had brought greater community awareness to their arts education issues, increased just the number of students they served. Nearly twice as many of the small arts organizations said that it increased the number of students they served compared to the larger, more established arts organizations. And this is going to be a challenge if the larger arts organizations think, well, we don't need this initiative, we don't need this common way of partnering with school districts, then they're not going to stick around. And the smaller arts organizations might kind of just be left hanging. So it's something that they're going to have to navigate carefully, I think, to make sure that, just like anything, just to keep this organization of organizations running smoothly.
Have you thought of any strategies to try to keep larger organizations engaged with these programs?
I think that I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a challenge for them to all be engaged so long as they felt like there was a sense of fairness and balance in terms of how schools were being steered towards different things, in terms of the funding agencies treating the organizations the same. And I think in general, there was a decent amount of goodwill among the organizations to feel like they were all in it together from organization to organization. That said, we did find other sources of friction just between the organizations in some sense, the different cultural organizations and the overall backbone organization that was administering the program, running the website, advising the schools on programming that would be good for them. And there we were able to identify a lot of interesting predictors of support for being a part of this organization. And these were very much related to issues of governance and finances. So the belief that the backbone organization was being transparent in their decision making, that they were effectively communicating how decisions were being made, that they responded to concerns of the different arts organizations and resolved competing priorities. And then another big one was ensuring that financial decisions were transparent, because the backbone organization was not just operating as a facilitator of arts engagement programs, but also a facilitator of donor dollars from philanthropy. And so those dollars are going into the backbone organization, and then at the end, filtering into arts organizations as they provided school services. And it was really essential that that was kept very transparent, and concerns that came out of that process were addressed.
If you could talk to a practitioner after having done this research, what's one piece of advice, something actionable that you could give them to do to improve their arts education programming, how they engage with the K-12 school system, things like that?
Advice that I would give arts practitioners, working in the education space and partnering with schools, I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I would give them is to figure out how to meet schools somewhere in the middle. But I think part of that requires changing the conversation. There is a national, if not international, backlash against standardized testing. And I mean, even now, we just saw the entire University of California system is now going to drop the SAT and ACT from college admission. And it's this growing belief that test scores don't capture everything. And I see this growing sentiment providing a vacuum that a lot of arts organizations can fill, but I think they need to do it deliberately, and they need to do it in a way where they actually take a leadership role in reframing the value of the arts, such that these things that I mentioned that they believe their programming is providing, increased social emotional learning, better creativity, better communication skills, confidence and self-esteem, to not try to sneak these things under the rug while they say that, maybe we'll improve test scores or we'll give your kids a fun day at the museum, but actually making it more deliberate and articulating that this is what we do and these are valuable things and these are things we care about. And I think we've especially seen that since the pandemic. Arts organizations have responded in really interesting ways by providing what a lot of people are needing to cope right now with what's going on. And you see with school systems, I don't see parents worried as much about their students falling behind academically as they worry about their students being able to understand, cope, and deal with this whole situation. More and more, I see parents turning to the arts through this, new homeschooling experiment that everybody went through. And so I think that arts organizations can seize this opportunity to really do what they've been doing, but be more articulate and deliberate about it.
Last question that I'll leave you with. What would you say is the next place you're going to put your focus in this area?
Well, one of the interesting things that I'm doing in the arts education space, I'm working with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and they've established a commission on the arts. And there's a lot of different influential artists, arts organizations, and philanthropies involved in this project. Actually, one of the goals is to reframe the value of arts education by putting it more in terms of the types of outcomes and using more of the language that artists and cultural organizations would use in terms of what we see as the value of the arts. Things that increasingly people seem to be demanding and hungry for in their lives, especially as, so many other areas of daily life have become quite tension filled. And the way that we're going forward through this project is we're going to identify and focus on different strategies that arts educators have used, artists are using around the country that are actually specifically going for these other types of outcomes that we think are essential to human life. That's where we should be going, I think.
Yeah, I can't agree more.
I think there's a lot to think about here with all of this.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you giving me some time out of your day.
No problem. Appreciate it.
Everyone, this was Brian Kisida, author of Arts Education Partnerships, Sources of Harmony and Dissonance with Cultural Institutions Collaborative Efforts. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.